Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Instructions, and more instructions. It's Ryan, chapter 28 of Exodus today. Thanks for coming and checking this episode out. At this point in the reading, you might be like, man, there are a lot of specific instructions. And we've seen these instructions so far around like building the tabernacle in very specific ways. And then in this chapter, God calls in the wardrobe department. He's like, hey, we need to make some stuff. And specifically, we can see this in verse 4 where he says that the chapter is going to focus on a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a tunic, a turban, and a sash, these specific clothing items. But most of this chapter is dedicated to the breastpiece and then ephod. They seem to be kind of these two really significant pieces. Now, there are probably a lot of things that could be said about this chapter, and I want to draw our minds to a couple of things, but the main thing I want us to focus on is the immense holiness of God. These instructions around these certain clothes and the ways to like build the tabernacle and engage with it aren't because, wearing a specific outfit like does something magical. It's kind of like how, nowadays, you talk about maybe wearing your Sunday best or the idea that you need to take your hat off while you pray. Well, great. If there's a way through the way that you dress, or maybe you like to remove your hat when you pray that kind of represents some kind of reverence or awe of God, great. But clothing or the lack thereof or however it works doesn't really accomplish something in and of itself. I think this chapter draws us to focus on the immense holiness and perfection of God. And this is something that I often struggle to think about. I can be maybe sometimes more cavalier in my relationship with God than I should be, in remembering this is a perfect God. Like, I am fortunate to walk into his presence and live. In fact, the chapter starts off in verse 1 talking about Aaron's sons and puts into two sets, Nadab and Abihu, and then Eleazar and Ithamar. And probably the reason why it's in these sets is because we'll see later that Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, just because of their lack of reverence for God, just kind of going into his presence and paying little regard for his holiness and perfection, are actually struck dead. So we see that the instructions in here, God starts to give these instructions around, these specific clothing items for the priests that, again, don't accomplish something magical, but represent kind of this obedience, these instructions, as these triggers that will remind us that God is perfect. So start putting together this ephod and this breastpiece with these specific instructions, and they're supposed to start collecting these special stones and placing them into the settings. And I think what's going to happen is then Aaron will put it on and he'll snap his fingers and half the population will wait, I think I'm in the wrong storyline here. But this does remind me of kind of a Thanos thing, but I don't think that's who Aaron is. But this very specific, putting this thing together, this ephod is this like sleeveless garment that the priest will put on, and this breastpiece that both of them represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, Israel isn't something special in and of itself, but it represents this people of God. And the priest is supposed to put these on while he's judging and while he's seeking God's will. And the idea, we see this in verse 29, is that whenever Aaron enters the holy place with those onyx stones at the tribes of Israel and the 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel, he's going to have the tribes of Israel over his heart, bringing God's people on his heart in a very pastoral way and seeking God's will. In verse 30, we see this weird thing about this Urim and this Thummim, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Truth is that scholars disagree on what those could mean or what they might mean, but we see that these are these two items that are often used in like seeking God's will. God, what do you want for these tribes of Israel? Later on, we see that Aaron's even going to show up to this party with bells on, taking this very literally. God says, come here. He's like, I'll be there with bells on. And again, this isn't because God needs to hear the bells and like, Aaron's coming. But Aaron's obeying these specific instructions to say, God, we are practicing reverence and awe. And you see another picture of this at the end of the chapter where God says, make these linen garments. And it takes my mind back to Genesis, where Adam and Eve can't really appear before God without this clothing on, because all of a sudden they realize their nakedness. They realize, their insufficiency in light of a perfect God. This is what God, I think, is calling us to. And I know I need to do a better job of this, and probably a lot of us could increase our practice in this. This doesn't mean we need to wear certain things or say magical words or any of these things. But when we approach God, when we understand who he is, when we approach his text, when we pray, when we are doing life, remembering that we're walking in the holy place. That curtain has been torn. When Jesus died, the curtain of the most holy place was torn, but that doesn't mean we just take that lightly. That means we walk very seriously in the steps of Jesus, knowing that we are walking lockstep with a holy God who has just graciously invited us into his presence. So as you go today, walk with reverence and awe in the footsteps of the holy God that loves you so much.